We made this.
Hello and welcome to Ask Us About Loom, a podcast covering point-and-click adventure games, interactive fiction, walking simulators, and all other kind of games that can be called adventure games or adventure game adjacent. At some point, I will try and find a way of making that a lot more neater and quicker and easier to say on the tongue. But I am your host, Matt Latham, and as always, this is the podcast where we talk about the adventure games and all that kind of stuff of the thing I've just said. I'm not alone. I have a guest with me to talk about a kind of British adventure game classic. I have Ashley Day with me. How are you doing, Ashley?
Hello. Yeah, I'm great, thank you. Thank you for having me. Very, very pleased to be here, considering that until a couple of weeks ago, we didn't know each other at all, and I kind of sprung into your inbox and said, hey, I'm the person you're looking for to talk about Simon the Sorcerer.
Yeah, because these are my credentials. I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, and kind of got scared into accepting you. But so I had a call. I kind of did put the call out on Twitter about like anyone who's interested in games and stuff, and and I think the kind of like the adventure game kind of genre, like, I don't want to say back in vogue, but there's a kind of like a nice sudden surge or a rejuvenation in popularity, or kind of like a buzz around the kind of genre and the online community that love this genre, and yeah, it's good. It's a good time to be an adventure game fan, I think.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, I'd say it's always a good time to be an adventure game fan, but there's been times where we haven't really been served with many new games for a while, and there seems to be a few coming out at the moment, including, I'm sure we'll talk about it, a new Simon the Sorcerer game next year.
Yeah, I mean that'll be interesting. I think we'll have a brief chat at that at the very end, when we talked about the game we're talking about. Which again, I think we dropped it. Yeah, we're going to here to talk about the first Simon the Sorcerer game, released in 1993, I think.
Yes.
Yes, by Adventuresoft, and published by Adventuresoft. Directed by Mike Woodruff and produced again by Mike Woodruff and Alan Bridgman. Designed by Simon Woodruff, programmed by Alan Bridgman, with art by Paul Drummond. Released on the Amiga, PC. It got re-released on Android and iOS. There's a Windows version coming. Yeah, next year it'll be 30 years old, which makes me feel suddenly very old. So very briefly, why did you decide to pick Simon the Sorcerer to talk about?
Well, because I was listening to another podcast that you're on, a Red Dwarf podcast.
Mm-hmm.
A big fan of the TV show, and quite simply, you said that you were looking for somebody to come on to ask me about Loom and talk about Simon the Sorcerer, and you're hoping for someone who was not just a fan of the game but also a fan of Red Dwarf to talk about the kind of the crossover between them. And I am that person. I think I first played Simon the Sorcerer would have been around about 95, 96, I think. And it has remained not just one of my favourite adventure games, one of my favourite games of all time. I have a huge amount of fondness and nostalgia for it, play it every few years. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, back in my days of being a games journalist, I interviewed Simon Woodruff about the game many years ago, and I even got to interview one of the cast members about it. So it's a very special game to me.
Yeah, so there's a bit of like interest for the Red Dwarf crew. So I think so this is an Ask Us About Loom episode, but this will also probably be going on to the Shipwrecked and Comatose feed. So if you're listening to this on the Shipwrecked and Comatose feed, hello there. Hello, Red Dwarf fans, you bunch of smegheads. Nice that you dip into this one, and I really hope that you think, oh yeah, Matt, he's the good-looking, but probably the number 5th favourite of mine of the Shipwrecked and Comatose crew. But I will check out the rest of his podcasts. So thank you for doing that. If we go back to the very, very, very beginning in terms of gaming, so do you remember like the first kind of point-and-click adventures you played? Or how you got into the genre?
Yeah, it's. I'm afraid it's a very predictable one. It's The Secret of Monkey Island was the first adventure game I played.
It's got a lot to answer for, that game, hasn't it?
And you know, that's probably the big reason why I became so obsessed with adventures as I got older. A friend of mine who lived on the street next to mine, his dad bought him an Amiga 500. I was a Mega Drive user at the time, and I was like, computers, boring. But he forced me to sit and play on his computer, and he showed me Monkey Island, and I was just in love straight away. I just thought it was amazing as as a console gamer and someone who'd I'd had a C64 as a much younger kid. To see that kind of like rich world to explore that just seemed to get bigger and bigger the more you played. I wasn't used to that kind of game at the time. And of course, I love the puzzles and the humour, the characters, the whole package, really. And yeah, what can you say? Monkey Island's a masterpiece. So it's not really surprising that that I just love the whole genre after that.
Okay, so and then I'm assuming you went to try and play as much as you possibly can. So when did you? Yeah, we said it was about 95, 96. Which version of it did you play? Was it the Amiga, the PC?
It was specifically the Amiga CD32 version. I'm holding the game in my hand right now. I still have it. So I was a CD32 owner. For those who don't know, that was the Amiga kind of CD-ROM games console that came out in I think it was 1993, same year as Simon the Sorcerer. And I had a proper Amiga as well, but the CD32, it was kind of exciting because CD-ROM technology was quite new, but also Commodore went bust in 1994, so the console didn't really have much of a life, and there weren't that many games for it, and there also weren't that many games that actually took advantage of the CD medium. Most of the games were Amiga 500 titles that they just transplanted onto a CD. But I walked into this game shop, I saw Simon the Sorcerer on the shelf, and plastered all over the box, it says full talkie soundtrack. I was like, what does that mean? And quickly learned that meant that there was full voice acting in the game. Now, having previously played Monkey Island and Monkey Island 2, Beneath a Steel Sky on the Amiga, the idea of full voice acting was just mind-blowing. So I had to have it. I bought it there and then, and the rest is history.
Particularly if anyone under a certain age probably can't underestimate the power that the word talkie had when describing a version. I remember having Beneath Steel Sky, the Amiga version, and it's 15 discs, and disc 7 not working, so I had to go and get it replaced. Had to trek all the way to W.H. Smith and explain that the disc didn't work and had to get a replacement. But then they gave me a refund. So they gave me a refund, and I could not find another copy of the Amiga version. And then a few years later, when we had a PC, had the CD version of Beneath Steel Sky, and blew my mind not realising there was voice acting in it. Yeah, and it was just the advertise, for adventure game fans, the word talkie was like a revelation, kind of like, oh, you have to, you're not an adventure game fan if you don't have the talkie version. But
yeah, I think it makes a big difference to this era of adventure games as well, because a lot of them followed in the footsteps of LucasArts.
Yeah,
in that they were comedy adventures.
Yes.
So to get comedy performances in the game from professional comedy voice actors, it really kind of amplified and escalated what they were trying to achieve. They're trying to make a funny game, voice acting made it funnier, so it was really important, I think.
Yeah, I think it added to it, and and I think pretty much this being a kind of British game, the Adventuresoft decided to go for a kind of known celebrity voice to lead the game, and Chris Barrie from Red Dwarf to hosting stuff, and I think having that aspect, particularly I think this was around the age that I was discovering Red Dwarf, and I think British Empire was on at the time as well.
Definitely was.
Yeah, even though I've done specials on Shipwrecked Carmen specials on British Empire, I keep forgetting when it was released, but yeah, I'm pretty sure we're in series 3 or 4 of British Empire. So Chris Barrie is pretty much a mainstream kind of name in British comedy at this moment in time. So he's not like one of the main cast of this cult BBC Two sitcom. He's the lead in a a very successful BBC One comedy, which is in the early 90s, like massive. Chris
Yeah,
Pratt, yeah,
I think it's easy to forget now because Red Dwarf has kind of endured, and they
yeah,
have, recently had some new series as well. The British Empire was even bigger than Red Dwarf. It's a BBC One sitcom. If you were a teenager in the 90s, you watched Red Dwarf, but your parents watched the British Empire.
yeah.
It spoke to a wider audience. So yeah, he was definitely a household name at this point.
And did you know that Chris Barrie was the voice of Simon before you bought it? Or
No, I was just thinking about that actually. So I'm looking at the CD case, and it doesn't actually say. I mean, they're terrible at marketing. It doesn't say anywhere on the box that he's in the game. You only find out either from playing it and recognizing him, or open the manual and he's in the credits. So I can't really remember, but it must have been a huge surprise for me to start playing the game and find out like the star of my favorite TV show was the main character. And I don't know about you, but obviously there's a fantastic cast in Red Dwarf, but Rimmer was always my favorite character in the show. He's the most entertaining, the source of most of the comedy. So I was a big fan of Chris Barrie.
yeah, I'm Team Rimmer all the way. Rimmer, I think, is like not just the funniest, but I also think he's probably the most complex character.
Yeah, definitely.
At the four, I think at the time of recording, we have finished Series 7 and Series 6, and I think if I can remember what I said about Series 6, we're going to start to get to some very interesting concerns I have with the Rimmer character as we get to Series 8 and beyond. But again, that's a whole other discussion for a different podcast.
I'll have to remember not to spoil anything as well, because your co-host hasn't seen any of the new series, has he?
No, he hasn't. No. But
so I'll keep stum on that.
In terms of like Red Dwarf, I mean, I'm assuming that if you was a massive fan of Red Dwarf before you bought the game, so I'm assuming that if the box had said starring Chris Barrie from Red Dwarf, that would increase the speed of buying it.
I would have paid double.
Yeah, but I think we was talking before. So we was talking before we started recording that Red Dwarf is like one of your, if not your favourite, either comedy or TV show of all time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I was just the right age at the right time. In 1993, I was 11, and Red Dwarf was just one of those programs that if you're a kid with like a TV in your bedroom, got to like 9 o'clock, you put Red Dwarf on, and you just had a great time because the humour was just pitched perfectly. I think anyone can enjoy it really, but if you're a young lad in the 90s, it was just like it was made for you. Big fan. To the point where I met Doug Naylor, one of the co-creators of the show. I went to a book signing of his in Leeds. This was around the time, I think it was in the gap between Series 6 and Series 7. So I was like pestering him, like, when's the new series coming back? And he was very nice, told me it was coming soon, which it was. And later on in life, I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, but when the series was revived with Back to Earth on the Dave channel, I was working for a magazine publisher at the time, and they had a sci-fi magazine. In their business, I worked on a games magazine, but this sci-fi mag, they wanted to cover the new series of Red Dwarf. They knew I was a fan, and they were like, "Do you want to interview some of the cast?" I was like, "Yes, I do." That sounds amazing.
I'm assuming you played your call and went, "Well, do I want to interview the cast?" Well, you know what? If you throw in, but no, I'm pretty sure they didn't even finish the sentence before you see.
I jumped at the chance. So I got to interview over the phone Chris Barrie and Danny John Jules. Danny John Jules is funny because he didn't turn up for his first interview appointment with me, so I just sat there waiting, and it didn't happen.
Okay.
Which I think it's quite funny when you kind of know the behind the scenes stuff on Red Dwarf, and you know that Danny John Jules is a bit more of a kind of like Jack the Lad character. And then when he eventually did turn up, and after we rescheduled the interview, he was very clearly on a mobile phone, just like walking around the streets of London. So I think he just like squeezed me in when he could be bothered. But actually, he was really good. He spoke for like an hour and a half and just gave me loads of good stuff. And went off topic several times. Talked about Blade 2, for example. And yeah, Chris Barrie was an absolute delight as well. That's like one of the greatest things I've done in my life, because he's a bit of an idol, to be honest.
Ah, okay. So you've say you've interviewed Chris Barrie, and you've actually spoken to Chris Barrie about Simon the Sorcerer.
Yeah, very, very, very briefly. Obviously, the interview I was being paid to do was about Red Dwarf, but I couldn't help myself. I had to ask about Simon the Sorcerer, and there was there was a moment where you could tell he was thinking like, what is he talking about? And then he was like, "Oh, you mean the game?" I was like, "Yeah, the game." And he, I don't know what I was expecting, but he was like, "Look, I don't really have much to say about it. It was just a job at the time." I was like, "Oh, okay." But I did say to him, I said, "Look, I'm a really big fan of that game, and it's stuck with me for years. And I'm sure there are like many other people who played it and feel the same way. So I think you should be quite proud of that performance." And he said, "Okay, I will be." He was very polite. I'm not sure what else I expected him to say, but it was nice to be able to let him know that something that from his perspective is a very small part of his career had actually meant a lot to somebody out there.
Because it was a British game, and I was trying to think about in terms of kind of. It's not, again, I keep having the word AAA, but I don't think you didn't have AAA games on what we think AAA games are nowadays. So, like, it wasn't like a big studio. I mean, at this point, it's a self-published game, but I think to a certain generation, it's one of the more high-profile adventure games, particularly for, I think, British adventure games as well. I'm not 100% sure how well it did in the US.
So I was reading a book this morning written by an American, and he was saying it was virtually non-existent there. It was released in America. It was released by Activision, and they released it under the Infocom label. So Infocom in the past had done text adventures like Zork. So it made a lot of sense to put graphic adventures under that same label. But apparently it didn't get widespread distribution, no real marketing, so not really popular in America. So a very British experience, I think. And the game's very British as well. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Tons of British humour to it.
For those who've not played Simon the Sorcerer, if you're listening to this, this is going to be very similar to how previous episodes are going to happen. We're going to have a chat about the game, just a brief overview of it, what it's like, how it works, but I'm not going to spoil anything. So what's going to happen, I'm going to give you advance warning. So if you've not played it and you want to know if you want to know if you're going to play it, keep listening, because we'll kind of advertise the game for you, and then what we'll do is at a certain point we'll give you advance warning that we're going to be talking about spoilers now and ruin the game for you if you've not played it. So we'll give you advance warning before we get to that. So okay, so for those who, Simon the Sorcerer is basically almost like a very classic-esque LucasArts influenced point and click game with 12 verbs in the bottom and an inventory. Very, very similar to how the Scum engine works. And the Scum engine worked, and you play a apparently 12-year-old but I've never fully understood the age of the main character. He's supposed to be.
Well, do you know what? So in the manual it says he's 12. Later on in the game he says he's 14. And Chris Barrie was 33.
Yeah.
and he doesn't sound like a teenager.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you told me he was kind of like 18 or 19, I probably would have believed you. But he's supposed to be a preteen, but so, for example, the Wikipedia synopsis for the plot goes, on his 12th birthday, a young boy named Simon is surprised when he receives a dog as a present from his parents, which he names Chippy. Unknown to Simon, his parents found the dog at their front door without warning, wrapped in paper and possessing a book that no one could read, and eventually dumped in the loft. Sometime after his birthday, Simon hears Chippy playing around in the loft, to which he discovers he's holding the book in his mouth. Reading it, he notices it is titled Ye Old Spell Book, and unwittingly reads out a spell on one of the pages. A portal suddenly appears, which Chippy enters. Simon follows him and winds up in another world, dressed in a wizard's robe. After Simon escapes a group of goblins with Chippy's help, he soon finds his way to a village. With the dog's help, he's brought home to the wizard Calypso, to which he finds that Calypso has been kidnapped and needs Simon's help to be able to come home, and he's also under the siege of a wizard called Sordid. And then eventually, what will eventually leads Simon on a quest to rescue Calypso, defeat Sordid, and to save the kingdom. And on the way, there's a whole bunch of cast of characters in very fully realised, in very very lusciously designed kind of pixel art backgrounds, and with a good sense of humour.
Yeah, and I think worth mentioning as well, a lot of those characters are like parodies of characters from, fairy tales and nursery rhymes, or like fantasy books. So a lot of kind of like knowing humour for, I think, most like teenagers playing this game at the time would have grown up like reading these stories. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the one of the key selling points as well is that the humour is very much influenced by Discworld, Monty Python.
Yeah, well, do you know that this started out as a Discworld game?
No, it wasn't. Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the Simon and Mike Woodruff, who were a father and son team, they pitched it as an official Discworld game, and then they were unsuccessful getting the license, so they decided to carry it on but make their own character up. And I've read a few interviews where they were saying that they're actually really glad that happened, because obviously if they'd have made a licensed game, they don't own the IP. It would be very difficult to make sequels, but actually it was quite fortuitous to them that they've got a whole series of these games now, and they can do whatever they like with it.
That's interesting, because I wonder when the idea to do Discworld kicked off.
I got the impression it was not too long before the game went into development, so it would have been around 91, 92. I have no idea when The Colour of Magic came out, but it must have been like late 80s, I think.
But I'm just wondering whether, like, if they got approached, we wanted this point-and-click adventure game in Discworld, and they went, no, and then as they left, people in that office went, shall we do our own?
Yeah, because there was a proper Discworld adventure, wasn't there? And it came out not long after this. I think it was about 95 it came out.
Yeah, it was. I think it was a launch title for PlayStation.
Mm.
Yeah, the original one. I remember that being one of the first games on the PlayStation, alongside I think Broken Sword as well. I think.
Yeah, and you talked about like the TV stuff that influenced it. Simon Woodruff has mentioned that he was a massive fan of Blackadder, for example, Red Dwarf, obviously, and I think The Young Ones is another show that he's mentioned. And I think you can definitely see all of those influences in the game. For me, it's got exactly that kind of like juvenile, slightly like cynical humor to it. So like very similar to the the Monkey Island games were very comical, but the humor in Simon the Sorcerer is a bit more kind of sardonic.
Yeah,
the Monkey Island a bit darker, which I think British humor generally is a bit darker than American humor anyway. And characters in British sitcoms like to insult each other and point out each other's flaws quite a lot, which is very different to American shows, which are a little bit more light-hearted, I think.
Yeah, and I think the game world itself, and I remember reading kind of like reading into the development in that the story and the puzzles were written around the characters, so the puzzles weren't the primary focus of development. I think the puzzles came after, so there's a very strong emphasis on character. You
can definitely tell that the puzzles weren't a huge priority. I was playing this game again a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed like so many puzzles, the item that you need to solve them is in the same room as the puzzle. So I don't think they thought too hard about a lot of them.
Yeah, and I think before we start, and before we probably go on to the actual in-depth bit for people who haven't played it to tune out. The one thing that I didn't realise, and was that Adventuresoft were basically based where I'm from, Birmingham.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although that said, though, they are Sutton Coldfield, which is I am practically on the near opposite side of Birmingham. Sutton Coldfield is practically like the full span of the whole area away from where I am. So I'm like the furthest part away from where Sutton Coldfield is. But yeah, I didn't realise that they were based.
Yeah. Yeah, they were. I think they ran a computer shop in Sutton Coldfield, and they got their start by taking American text adventure games and converting them to like lots of British computers and then selling them in the UK. So a very kind of small like cottage industry start. And then I was reading about how Simon Woodroffe got into game development. When he was a kid, his dad knew a guy who ran a professional game developer. They were making Dungeons and Dragons games for the Amiga. And the guy who ran the place broke his arm and couldn't operate the computer anymore. So he hired Simon Woodroffe to come in and use the keyboard and mouse for him and would just tell him what to do. He was like, arranging like graphical tiles to create scenes and characters. And the guy realized after a while, actually, like Simon's so good at this, I don't need to be here anymore, and just kind of left him to it. And that's how Simon, as like a very, very young lad, learned the craft of making games, as well as the fact that his dad ran this computer shop and was converting games as well. So quite a lucky guy, I think, to be in like the right place in the right time and be surrounded by people who can just show him the ropes.
Yeah, I think before I think they started on Simon the Sorcerer, they were originally called Horrorsoft.
Yes.
Yeah, and they kind of focused on text adventure games, I think, more than.
So they focused on text adventure games when there was an American company called Adventure International, run by quite a famous text adventure creator called Scott Adams. Mm-hmm. So part of their business was Adventure International UK, where they would bring over those text adventures. But then they also started making horror games under the name Horrorsoft. And they made a couple of games starring Elvira, who's a bit of a cult figure in America, kind of like a witch-like sorceress TV presenter, who I don't think she's that well known in the UK, but like I think people of our generation who are into like nerdy stuff will like know the name. Anyway,
I don't know much about her. I know the name, and I'm pretty sure I remember playing a demo of a Commodore 64 platformer with her as the character, but I don't really know much. My understanding is that she's like a Tales of the Crypt, kind of anthology host, and that's as much as I can.
That's about as much as I know as well. But I think she's quite. I think if you're an American of a certain age and you're watching that kind of show, maybe you watched a bit of Mystery Science Theatre, I think Elvira's someone you'd be quite familiar with.
Yeah, so and then I think they kind of changed the name of the company as they was developing Simon the Sorcerer.
Yeah.
So this is your stop off warning now, people. If you like what we're talking about, feel free to stop, play the game. If you've played it or you're not really bothered about being spoilt, carry on listening, because carry on listening.
I will say at this point, if you're an adventure game fan and you like the Monkey Island games, which you probably do,
mm-hmm.
you'll be very comfortable with Simon the Sorcerer, because it's almost like somebody took Monkey Island, removed the art and put in new art. It follows the template very, very closely, which one of the advantages of that is it's very easy to get into. You know what you're doing, you know how the game works, and it follows a very familiar structure. So yeah, probably most adventure game fans, if they haven't played this game, I think they'll be right at home, don't you?
Yeah, I think they will. Yeah, so I think, and again, particularly if you've got a very British sense of humour, you'll probably like a lot of this as well. So Simon the Sorcerer. I think when I was trying to look for like kind of anything pieces online about it, I kind of got thrown for a second when I started googling stuff. Like googling Simon the Sorcerer analysis throws a very interesting thing I never knew before until like a week ago. In that, have you ever heard of Simon Magus?
No.
No. Okay. So Simon Magus was a religious figure whose confrontation with Peter is recorded in Acts 8:9-24 in the Bible. The
Ah.
act of simony, or paying for a position, is named after Simon, who tried to buy his way into the power of the apostles. An alternative name for Simon Magus was Simon the Magician or Simon the Sorcerer.
Ah.
So yeah, there's a so according to Acts, Simon was a Samaritan magus, a religious figure of the 1st century AD and converted to Christianity, baptized with Philip the Evangelist. Simon then later clashed with Peter. Accounts of Simon by writers of the 2nd century exist, but are not considered verifiable. Surviving traditions about Simon appear in Orthodox texts, such as those of Irenaeus, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Justin Martyr, Hippolytus, and Epiphanes. I'm going to butcher that, so I'm not going to pronounce it. And he's often described as the founder of Gnosticism, which is like I think like a subsect of Judaism, I think. Yeah. So, and on the Wikipedia article, there's a section about Simon Magus in popular culture, and there is one entry in the video game section, which is that Simon lends his name, but very little else, to Simon the Sorcerer. And I just found that interesting, and I was like, and I thought there was a kind of link to it. Turns out, I think it was a complete and utter coincidence. So I spent about a good half an hour to 45 minutes reading into Simon the Sorcerer, thinking, oh, is there some sort of clever kind of link with this biblical kind of reference? And there isn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, isn't it, with this sort of thing? But I've this morning I've been reading through loads of old interviews, and nothing like that was mentioned. And it is, it's worth acknowledging as well. The writer of the game is called Simon, and he does mention in the interviews that a lot of the character is based on himself and his own sense of humour. So possibly a coincidence, but it's a fantastic coincidence. Actually, I really like it.
Yeah, I just think it's. I just thought it was interesting. And the Wikipedia goes, for the Samaritan, sometimes known as Simon the Sorcerer, please see Simon Magus, which is right at the top of the Wikipedia article. But with the game itself, I remember really, really liking it. I've always had a soft spot for it, and for years I've always had a certain piece of music in my head that I did forget where it was from at one time, until realizing that it was like the music you hear for like the first 30 minutes of the game, which is the so I've always had a soft spot for Simon the Sorcerer. I think I'll get the kind of little niggles that I have out the way now, so we can continue being quite praising of it. Because I think as I was replaying it, I think this was like the first time in perhaps at least a decade, even a decade and a half, since I last played it or looked at it. And there was a couple of things that I kind of picked up that was like that adult me was like, oh, okay. I think mainly it's mainly about the kind of aspect of the story that kind of throws me for a second, where like you're introduced to try and rescue the damsel in distress is actually the wizard Calypso and the villain Sordid, but you don't really have any. You don't really see them until like you don't see Calypso at all, do you? Apart from the voice, and then you don't really see Sordid until the end, so he's not really doesn't feel much of a threat.
Do you know what? I went through exactly the same thing. So I played it for the first time in a long time, and it's the first time I've really considered that.
Yeah.
If you compare to like The Secret of Monkey Island, where LeChuck is the villain, they have these cutscenes where they constantly go back to him and they show like who he is and why he's a threat. Sordid, you only really like hear about him, and you don't see him until the last 5 minutes of the game.
Yeah, I mean, you have no idea what he looks like. until like the end and stuff. And yeah, so it's not really built there. And again, if you compare it back to Monkey Island, for a while, retroactively, you don't realise you're interacting with each other because the character of Fester Shinetop, spoilers, you realise that a character that you've been interacting with has actually been the villain all along. So it kind of builds that kind of threat and that antagonism between the main character and the villain. And yeah, so you've always kind of got an idea of who you're dealing with. So LeChuck, he's there, he's apparent, so you know who you know the end of level boss more or less. Whereas Swordy, you just hear kind of he's just passing, and you don't really have that chance to kind of know who he is or why Simon should really care.
Yeah, I think from a storytelling perspective, that is definitely a flaw.
Yeah.
However, I think it does give the game a very different tone to Monkey Island. Monkey Island, obviously, as we've talked about, the threat is ever present and reminded to you. There's also the fact that a lot of the game is like at night in the dark. You're dealing with men of low moral fibre and kind of unscrupulous characters. Whereas in Simon the Sorcerer, it's in the daytime. You're exploring like beautiful woodland environments with amazing background scenery, with this really nice music, as you've said. I also think the music's really catchy, and it gives most of the game, because there isn't really a sense of threat in the game, it gives it a really different kind of relaxing vibe that I think is much to its benefit, actually. Like this is a game you can like just sit back and chill out and absorb the world. You walk around the forests and little creatures will run around in the background, like a wolf or a deer, or some ducks will be quacking in a pond. It's actually quite a nice game, I think.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think that kind of, and I think the only other kind of niggles that I might probably have is that I think there's a couple of times, and this is down to, I think, me being used to the LucasArts way of doing things, is that, and I never noticed this until playing Simon the Sorcerer, or the first bit of Simon the Sorcerer a few days ago, is that I think when you've got stuff that's triggered by dialogue puzzles where you have multiple choices and one choice will trigger the characters to move on to the next thing. So in this case, it's when you're talking to the wizards and you eventually talk them into accepting you to go on this quest. In LucasArts games, you get kind of preconditioned that the trigger is always the last dialogue option.
Yeah.
Whereas in this, a few times it's random or it's not the last option. So I got into the kind of habit of just going through and exhausting all the kind of dialogue options you can choose before choosing the last one, which is going to be the one to move things on. So you've got the interplay and stuff. But with, I think, a couple of times I'm the Sorcerer, like the option to convince them to make you a wizard, the second out of like 3.
Yeah.
And you kind of miss the.
Yeah, I think sometimes the solutions are easy to miss.
Yeah.
Not just in the dialogue options, but like I noticed in the last third of the game in particular, there's a lot more kind of like pixel hunting in the game, like crucial elements that are very easy to overlook because they're made of like, I don't know, like 3 pixels, or they're not really like prominent in the graphics. So I think that's where you can tell this is a game that's made by a smaller team who don't have as much experience with puzzle design as like a big American company would have. So yeah, definitely some flaws here and there.
Okay, yeah, just to let people know that I just had to break up the recording section to pick up an Amazon delivery. No wizards in the box that was given to me. So
where were we? We were talking about all the things you hate about the game and how it's secretly rubbish.
Yeah, the game's secretly rubbish. Yeah, no, and I think and the only thing I think I probably noticed is that I think the game gives you far too much exploration from earlier on, so it's kind of easy to kind of because the game kind of tells you to find the wizards, and you could theoretically get to like the end of the forest before you even find them, and I think that and easily to get lost. I think, but
Yeah, there's this like middle section of the game that is all woodland with multiple paths through it, and not that many kind of landmarks that stand out. And when you remember, like, oh, okay, well, I think for this solution, I need to go and speak to this person. Oh, they were in the woods. Oh no, what am I going to do? Because you're going to spend 5 minutes just walking around trying to remember where they were. And there is a map where you can fast travel, but there are not enough. They should have put more kind of landmarks on that map, because that's probably the worst part of the game for me, is just the backtracking through those woods that all look the same.
Yeah, but that was kind of like the only kind of things that I kind of lingered
to
for me.
To be clear, this is a perfect game, and I love it.
Oh yeah,
it's just a perfect game with lots of flaws.
Yeah, I mean, like things are always things we love are always flawed. I mean, again, if you're listening to this as Shit Wrestling Comatose, we've talked about some of the flaws in Red Dwarf, but I think they kind of make it more endearing, and I think even flawed games are even things with flaws make it more perfect, or a perfect experience, or a better experience anyway. And I think a part of it is its charm, and I mean, and then if we drift back to just being to like talk about how much we love about the stuff we love about the game now, I mean, there's the kind of backtracking and walking through these forests and scenery and stuff, but they are beautifully rendered, beautifully designed. It's very lush. There's parts where you'll walk through. Admittedly, some screens which have no game relevance for puzzles whatsoever.
Yeah.
But there's one moment where you'll walk and a wolf appears. And I remember when that first happened, I was like, "Crap, how am I going to pass this wolf?" But the wolf is just animated scenery and has no effect on the game ever. There's birds that fly. There's like a living, breathing kind of ecosystem.
Yeah.
Happening in this magical forest, and it looks stunning.
Yeah, that's true. And I was reading about the visuals this morning. It's a strange game because half of the game is pure pixel art, and then another half of the game is they were hand drawn paintings that were scanned into the computer and then drawn over the top. Okay. So all of the game, in my opinion, looks beautiful, but there are definitely some scenes that look like way richer and more detailed than others. So they must be the hand painted ones. But either way, like it's a gorgeous game.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I thought it was all pixel.
Yeah, well, I think even with the hand painted stuff, because they had to draw over the top, it still has like a pixely look to it, but just a much more detailed one.
Yeah, so you got this kind of like lush, kind of like forest. There's like kind of like nice kind of emerald greens throughout it. There's also and you got your kind of stereotypical kind of like city or medieval town at the start. There's a part where you get to this kind of like icy mountain top, which is quite nice as well, and like a kind of very dark reddish hellscape that you get to at some point. And it looks really nice. And the one thing that I remember I remember kind of noticing, particularly in this period as well, is the character animations and the character art are really, really good. I mean, from the introduction, the credit sequence has Simon come out and start waving his wand to conjure up the credits, and the smoothness in the animation and the expressiveness in what is like a low kind of, not exactly low res, but still kind of pixel character is very impressive. The amount of frames of animation on show is ridiculously kind of technically quite impressive.
Yeah, it's great. I think they put a lot of effort into making Simon in particular like this animated character that's like fun and interesting to watch. And later on in the game, there's quite a lot of situations he gets into that have completely bespoke animations that were drawn just for that one moment that might last 5 seconds or so. So, and it really just, it contributes to this feeling of it being kind of like a rich, well produced video game, I think.
Yeah, there's a moment in the animation at the start where like Simon's pulling out things out of his hat.
Mm.
There's depth because you can tell when he moves back or leans forward. The one that kind of stood out to me, there's a bit where he tries to conjure something out of the hat, scratches his head out of the hat, takes his hat off. Chippy the dog is on his head.
Yeah.
Chippy the dog's head, it drops off. He leans forward and smooths his hair and puts his hat back on. But you can tell his hair's a mess. And when he smooths it down, there's like a parting you can tell. And it's so smooth. It's
And that's all in the intro sequence, which they didn't even need to have that. Like the game is complete without that intro sequence. So I think it feels like it's made by like a team of people who just love what they're making, right?
Yeah, and I think that introduction as well kind of introduces you to the character of Simon, where like the self kind of like meta referencing game humor. Where there's one point where it goes, "I'm surprised you're still watching this," and waves more credits and stuff. And there's a part where suddenly where an attractive blonde lady appears out of the hat, and he goes, "I didn't have time to even get her phone number," and then tries to conjure back, and then brings up this kind of like demonic creature that he ends up blasting. The character animations are very good. What's your take on the characterization of Simon as a character?
What's my take on him? I think he's a very likable character. It helps that he was a teenager at the time I was playing. I was a teenager as well, so he was really easy to identify with. It's fun that he comes from the real world and he gets zapped into this fantasy world. So you kind of like you're both learning about this world at the same time, and it's just as weird to him as it is to us. And then he's got this like wry, sardonic humor to him. So, everyone that he meets, everything that he encounters in this world, he's got a sarcastic take on it. He's got a joke to make about it. So you're getting a commentary on the world as you go, which is like massively enhanced by Chris Barrie's voice acting as well. Like perfect casting for this kind of character. Chris Barrie's so good at that kind of like, you look at the Rimmer character in Red Dwarf, he's an idiot, but he's an idiot who thinks he's smarter than everybody else, thinks he's better than everybody else, and can't understand why he's like not successful in this world where he's superior, or where he feels superior. And I think that's, that made Chris Barrie's performance perfect for Simon the Sorcerer, where he's like a smart aleck teenager who doesn't really want to engage with the world in any meaningful way. He just wants to like take the mickey out of everything, which is great for an adventure game as well, because it's I wouldn't say Simon the Sorcerer is a particularly like dialogue heavy game. There can be times where you're walking around the world and in a lesser game, I think it would feel quite lonely. But it doesn't, because you've constantly you've got this companion in Simon who, is just going to pass comment on everything. You're going to have a laugh with him, and I think they get the balance just right. Like if he was just a little bit more like sarcastic, I think he would become unlikable. But they never really pass that tipping point. So he's, for me, he's just like good fun to hang around with in this game.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into other games in the franchise, because we're going to be talking about the first game. But I've seen people like kind of criticize the character of Simon and say he's very, very unlikable. I've only played this number 2. I've not played 3, 4, or 5. Well, I briefly skimmed playthroughs of 3D, 4, and 5. Because I've seen criticisms of him as a character there. Aside from the fact that in 4 and 5 he's turned American, from what I've seen, he seems to be a very unlikable character in later games, which a criticism I don't think works in number 1. I think he's kind of he's not cruel. I mean, if anything, I think Guybrush in Monkey Island 2 is a lot more kind of a conscientious character than Simon ever is in this game. But yeah, I think he's not. He doesn't seem to be rude or not overly rude or kind of too insensitive.
No, he's not. He's not nasty.
Yeah, he's not nasty. So he'll probably have a sarcastic kind of comment about people, but he doesn't seem to actively kind of want to kind of break people or be really nasty. I think the only time he ever gets to the verge of that is this when he's interacting with the Swampling, but we'll get into him in a bit.
Oh, we definitely need to talk about Swampling. It's probably my favourite part of the game.
Yeah, but I think in this game at least, in Simon Sorcerer 1, Simon is relatively likeable. He's got a charm to him. And he's got that kind of British sarcastic humour that kind of just works. And when he interacts with this wide and vast kind of cast of characters, and on the replaying and watching videos of the game, I've forgotten just how many different characters there are in this game, and they're all kind of very expressive. They're all kind of unique. I was going to say memorable, but I had forgotten quite a few of them. But then again, it has been a long time since I've replayed it. But there's there's a lot of kind of unique voices, some kind of funny stuff. For example, I think the one that everyone kind of remembers to the point where the character appears in every single game is the one that steals the hearts of the audience, which is the poor Swampling, who's, I said, I think it's the character other than Simon that I remember even more than Saw did, which is kind of weird, because if you ever said that again, going back to Monkey Island, no one ever forgets LeChuck. They always seem to remember LeChuck Lane and stuff, but yeah, they always seem to forget Sordid and remember the Swampling. So, what do you think? What do you think it is about the Swampling that people like or kind of feel sympathy for?
I think the Swampling's just adorable, to be honest. Yeah. So, if anyone who, I mean, I know we're in the spoiler section, but if anyone who hasn't played this game, you at one point in the game you enter this hut over a swamp, and there's this kind of newt-like character, little green lizard. I always thought it was a woman, but reading online, everyone else seems to think it's a man. But it's got a very feminine voice. Really, really lonely character, and it's his birthday, and he's expecting a big birthday party, expecting all of his friends to turn up, but only Simon arrives. Simon's a stranger to him, just stumbles into this world, and he becomes like trapped with this very kind of clingy, affectionate Swampling who wants to have a birthday party with him, and to celebrate the birthday, he wants to serve him swamp stew from a cauldron, which is this kind of viscous, green, nasty tasting stew. And Simon has to sit there and eat it, and as soon as he's finished a bowl, the Swampling gets him another one and another one. And you can escape, but it can go on, and actually there's a puzzle where you have to eat quite a lot of the stew and smuggle some of it into other containers in order to move the story along. But even before you get to that stuff, I think the performance, particularly the voice performance of the Swampling, is really kind of cute and sympathetic. The way he's like, "Oh, for my birthday," your heart melts a little bit, because you can instantly tell, oh, this is like, this is a pretty harmless character, and obviously very, very lonely, and you just want to, I just want to like give him a little hug and tell him it's all going to be okay. But at the same time, I'm like, I wouldn't want to sit and eat that stew and make conversation with him for too long. So you have a bit of sympathy for Simon at the same time. But it's just a great scene. One of the standout scenes in the game, I think.
Yeah, I think you kind of get sympathy for the Swampling when he says he's being lonely, but then you can also kind of get the impression that there's a reason that people aren't turning up, because like his stew is kind of that bad, but he's kind of clinging stuff. And I think it's the game, and I think if he does turn up in every other game in the franchise, I mean, I'm not going to spoil it, but I love what they do with him in the sequel. Um, I'm not going to
I
spoil
can't.
what.
I can't. I don't think I can remember. I've only played the sequel once, and it was 2005. So what, like 17 years ago?
Yeah.
When I last played it. Like, is there something to do with like fast food?
Yes.
Yeah, classic.
Yeah. But yeah. So it goes into that, and I think it's become kind of like one of the mainstays of the franchise.
Mm.
Even more so than I think Calypso and Alex, who you don't even see in this game. But and I think there are kind of other kind of like characters they interact with, and ones I remember. I really love the Woodworm.
Yeah.
The Woodworm, like there's like if they part of the puzzle is that they want kind of wood to eat because they've been on this stump for ages, and there's a nice kind of thing where kind of Simon, like, I didn't know Woodworm can talk, and it's like, and there's a very kind of almost Monty Python-esque kind of debate and argument that happens between them and stuff, and it sounds so much like it belongs in the Life of Brian or the Holy Grail. Oh, just because we're Woodworm doesn't mean we can't not talk. That's typical of humanity, isn't it? It sounds like it's John Cleese and Michael Palin and Eric Idle just moaning about it, or it just sounds so much like a Monty Python sketch. And then there's a bit where any other game would have gone too long, but it probably would have gone on too long. But because it's so very entertaining, there's a bit where they're arguing about what kind of wood to want, and it's like balsa, teak, and then someone goes mahogany. Oh, I could go for a bit of mahogany, and it's just so entertaining. But it's I don't know about you, but it reminded me so much of kind of like the arguments that happen with like the People's Front of Judea in the or whatever. What did the Romans ever do for us? Sketch.
Yeah, definitely.
It's got that cadence to it. It's got that cadence to it when they're talking about like what wood to eat and stuff.
I love that scene too, and I love the tree stump. You have to pass it about 4 or 5 times before it triggers them calling out and talking to you, which I think is really effective because you've obviously written off this stump as just like a part of the scenery, so it's nice and surprising when they do actually talk. But I will say that the puzzle around getting them some mahogany, I found really annoying, because actually what happens is you go into a room and there's a storage room for lots of different types of wood, and you just click on the one that says mahogany, and then you can feed that to them. So it's a very simple puzzle, but I was assuming, because you know what adventure games are like, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be way more complicated. So I was going through my inventory and looking at anything in my inventory that had any kind of wood in it, and then trying to feed that wood to them. So like at one point you get a hammer with a wooden handle. I'm like, oh, right, maybe this is what you have to do. And so they want mahogany. Maybe at some point you find a mahogany chair or something, but it's like, no, you just go into a wood storage room and get some wood. So I'd like confused myself by expecting too much from the game, and I don't know, maybe that's a joke on the part of the designers. I don't know, or maybe it's just the fact that like you were saying, they came up with the characters first and designed the puzzles later. Possibly,
yeah, but I think to even get to that room, there's a woodcutter who's a very depressed woodcutter blocking the thing. So so you meet a woodcutter who kind of moved into the area, and he goes, oh yeah, all this forest and stuff, and then realising, yeah, but I'm going to be the laughing stock of the woodcutter's girl, because who moves to an enchanted forest that can't be cut? Goes like, yeah, and there's like, I think a comment about house prices or something. He's saying, I can't move now, I can't afford to move. I'm a laughing stock. But then, in order to get into that, you need to find a metal called mithril, and to do that, you need to get a metal detector and use a metal detector. And like you have to randomly I can't see how you can do it without randomly using it on every screen. There's a screen where the metal detector finally gets used. I
don't think there's any real clue as to where you should be using it. I I think the only thing you could argue as a clue is that it's kind of like up in the mountains.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you could easily end up searching the entire game.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you have to kind of find a piece of rock that the blacksmith turns into a fossil, and then turns into a fossil. Then you have to go to this archaeologist digging and saying, "Oh, I found this here," and then they dig into a screen where the mithril is. Then you have to kind of find it in different pieces of dirt. Then you go back to the blacksmith to make the axe head, and then you go back to the woodcutter to get into that room with the mahogany and stuff. And so it's kind of
it's convoluted.
Yeah.
But that's what the adventure genre was like in the 90s, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not completely moon logic, I don't think. It's just kind of very difficult, and I think a couple of things that make logical sense just perhaps needed a bit more kind of hand-holding, kind of the hint to guide you where to go. I think that's what it was kind of lacking in a couple of bits.
I think the worst part of that entire sequence for me is when you do get into the woodcutter's house. If I'm remembering correctly about which house this is, there's a secret room below the fireplace, right?
Yes.
And to get there, you extinguish the fire, which is easy because you've got a fire extinguisher. But then there's a secret lever to like trigger the lift. And there's like what it is a brass hook in the fireplace, and all you have to do is push it. But because it's a hook, I spent ages thinking, oh, clearly I have to like put something on the hook. So I thought that was a pretty bad clue, to be honest, because it's a bit misleading. It has you trying out things that are nowhere near what you really have to do, and what you do have to do is just dead simple. So that's one where, even on this more recent playthrough, even though I've finished the game several times before, I just couldn't remember that solution, and I'm afraid I had to look online at some hints.
Yeah, I think this is part. I think where the evolution of the graphical interface and the interaction, where it's just like left click, right click, I think kind of helps, because I think because you've got like 12 verbs to go through, because you have to pick the right one, like the push and pull, and you probably hardly ever use these. Are probably kind of verbs that are only used once or twice in the game.
There's some very specific verbs like consume, which I'm sure you only use like once or twice.
Yeah, it's like I can't remember off the top of my head why how you use the turn on turn off commands in Monkey Island 1. I think use works on all of them, I think. But I think it's cool. I think again, there's that kind of bit, but it then leads, when you have the woodworm, there's a kind of clever use of them where you have to escape from a tower. You escape from a tower and you just use them on the floor, and you escape by getting them to eat your exit out. So in a similar way to in the tower, you find a kind of Rapunzel style maiden who turns out to actually be a pig that was who was supposed to be cursed into turning into a kind of very attractive lady, but they only did half the work. So
there's a horrible visual gag where she's like she kind of half stands out from behind a changing screen.
Yeah.
So you can only see half of her, and she looks like a typical like Rapunzel style character. So you've had to climb up her hair to get in the tower, and then she stands all the way out, and she's vertically split. So one half is like a Rapunzel type blonde girl, and the other half is a pig woman. It's horrible.
But then and I think Simon kisses her and she turns back into a pig. Back into pig, and part of me is that like preempts Fiona from the Shrek series a bit, where it subverts the kind of damsel in distress kind of trope. Yeah, and I'm getting to that bit. I'm like, oh yeah, this is it's not the same thing. I mean, I think there's a lot more kind of intelligent stuff happening in Shrek in terms of Fiona in the first film. Yeah. But yeah, there's like it's
I wouldn't say Simon the Sorcerer is a very positive game when it comes to female representation.
Yes.
Certainly a lot less than Monkey Island, which where Elaine is a great character in her own right. Like all of the female characters in Simon the Sorcerer, they're just kind of like, bearing in mind, Simon's a teenage boy from the 90s. Like they're all pretty much like women for him to lech over in one way or another. So there's another flaw if we're being completely objective about it.
Yeah, I think there's not many female characters in the game either.
No,
I don't. He's not completely. He's not fully lecherous either. And again, I think there are. I think later games in the series, I think, go down slightly questionable routes in terms of Simon. But I think in this one, I think he's again just kind of like a teenage boy, but just reacting. But yeah, it's not overly favourable to female characters in this one. But there's not really that many, which is
No.
there's the kind of the pig in the tower. There's the Valkyries. There's the Valkyries
In the pub.
in the pub, and there's there's the kind of wicked witch,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't.
I think that's about it.
Yeah, I can't think of any others.
Yeah, and they're all pretty negative depictions.
Yeah.
None of them have any real agency. Maybe the witch does a little bit. She's just there to defeat and solve the puzzle.
Yeah, and so there's that, which is perhaps another, which I think hasn't aged well. I think, but
yeah, exactly.
yeah, but I think and I think some of the like other cast of all, like other main characters, kind of have their kind of moment to shine. I do quite like the wizards. The wizards come across as like actually not being quite arsed and quite arsed. So when you first,
I've always wondered with the wizards, are they meant to be playing like a Dungeons and Dragons sort of game together?
Yeah, I think it's either that or kind of like or Mahjong or something or like Scrabble or something. I'm not sure.
Yeah, like if you just sit and listen to them, it sounds like they're discussing some sort of like they're trying to make sense of like a fantasy game that they're playing, which is a bit strange. But also at the same time, they deny that they're wizards and they pretend to be farmers and they have like Cornish, like West Country accents.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on for some reason.
Yeah, but I do quite like the answer to try and convince them to get to the next part of a dialogue puzzle tree is saying, "Oh no, we're not wizards, And one of the options that Simon can say is, "Yes, you are. I put the mouse cursor over you, and it says wizards." And then they're going, "Okay, then you're right," which I think is a great joke.
Yeah, I liked that.
Yeah, I was also quite a fan of the there's a moment where you get to a bridge and there's a troll blocking it, and they're pretty much rehearsing a daily thing that they have where the goat's gruff trying to get past, and like the one goat is on hind legs reading from a script, and then the troll was like, "Look, you've been perfectly fine to me and as an employer of the Gruff Corporation, but I do feel that the working conditions where I always end up being knocked into the river is a bit it's a bit degrading for me as a person. So I'm going
he's on strike and holding a placard.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, and I mean, oddly topical, and probably not. Oddly topical, and I'm not getting too political at the moment, but again, there's strikes are a thing again in the UK. But I do find it quite funny that the way to kind of get past is to pretty much break the strike by throwing the striking person off a bridge, which I'm like, okay, that hasn't dated well. But
there could have been an alternative solution where you help him, but you just hire an ogre to throw him away.
Yeah.
So that doesn't contribute to Simon's image very well, I suppose.
No, not at all. But again, the lead up to it, where the conversation where you've got kind of like the Billy Goat's gruff, reading through a script that they've gone through so many times to the point where they start talking about it like that. It's like a transaction that they do where they have to play act this same minutiae rhyme over and over again. It's just quite funny, and yeah. So you just got the troll holding the placard on strike, and it's a very funny very funny visual gag, I think. And I never realised until we're playing that there's a massive Lord of the Rings reference to the point where Gollum is an actual character you talk to.
Yep, and you get the ring as well.
Yeah, I didn't
to use as an item.
Yeah, again, I don't remember that being a thing at all, which probably means that I've not played this since. Okay, it's probably even longer.
It's quite late in the game, and it's in a location that is pretty difficult to get to because it's one of those ones where the trigger point is not very well visually called out in the game. So it's another one where I had to look at a guide to remember how to do it. So I think for a lot of people, you could play for hours, and if you give up at about halfway through, you're never going to see that scene.
Yeah, I think I saw on Reddit or Twitter someone saying that for weeks they didn't realise that you could click on there's like a little thing you can climb down to get to Gollum. They didn't realise that was a thing that you could use. So they were stuck for ages until finding a walkthrough or something, which told them they could go down, climb down, which it's kind of tough to get to. It's slightly annoying as well in the 25th anniversary version that I played, which was on the touchscreen tablet, Android tablet. There's a button which highlights all the hotspots you can do. Yep. It doesn't highlight the exit points. So so there's a couple of times where we can go behind a tree, and it doesn't quite highlight it. And I don't think the cursor tells you can walk to them either, which is again, we do like this game. We do, honestly.
I think some of these flaws are just inherent to the genre at the time as well. Like pixel hunting is a thing in adventure games, and some handle it better than others.
Yeah.
But on the whole, this is a treasured game for me. But sometimes when you love something and you spend a lot of time with it and you play it over and over again, you start to notice the flaws.
Yeah.
A bit more through that familiarity.
It's like I think slightly different context, but I remember finally playing Maniac Mansion for the first time many years ago, and finding it relatively unplayable purely because of what I've been used to in modern games, because the cursor doesn't highlight interactive things. It doesn't come up in the Scum engine. It doesn't tell you what's interactive, whereas other games would do. So if you put the mouse over, it will tell you where the noun would appear just above the Scum bar. Maniac Mansion doesn't even do that, which nowadays is like a massive sin in game development, I think. But and there's so those are the characters and in this kind of vast, kind of beautiful, gorgeous world that they go into. Later on, in the late side of the game, there's a bit where you kind of, when you get to the sordid, I think, castle or tower or whatever, and you lose all your inventory and stuff. There's not as many characters there, but you've got two demons, called Belt Grabber and Snogfondle. Where you have to find their names. Finding their names is a puzzle in itself, but they come across as kind of really bored, half-arsed bouncers who just want to go home. And I really quite like them. I think they appear in the sequel links, I think. But I've always remembered them because you've got one who's kind of so we're just going to do it here, and then you got the other one going irritated. Yeah,
it's funny that even demons aren't really a threat to you in this game.
Yeah,
quite passive.
Yeah, he goes we've been told to eat you on sight, but I don't think I can be bothered. Bothered, yeah. I just think that's kind of I would just quite like that aspect of the game stuff. So, AmigaReviews.levelthepost.com is a game that has kind of acted as an aggregator for a load of kind of reviews of Amiga games from all different sorts of magazines. And there's quite a few for Simon the Sorcerer. So, for example, Amiga Computing gave it 89%, 84% from Amiga Format. Amiga Joker, which is a German magazine, gave it 85%. Now, Amiga Power gave it 69%.
Oh, boo.
But this being Amiga Power, the Amiga Power review is entertainingly written. But
Amiga Power were always, I think, if they used the full kind of range of scores.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. So if they thought a game had a few flaws, it wasn't going to get anywhere near top marks. Whereas the Amiga magazines that reviewed both, did game reviews, but they also covered technology. They tended to be a bit more forgiving, I think.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, the first paragraph goes, oh, ho hum, another point-and-click adventure game, another Tolkien fantasy setting, another quest, another collection of puzzles to solve. Right, today's Friday. Simon the Sorcerer's got till Monday to make an impression, or he gets 69%. I think all the copies of Amiga Power are online, and the reviews are lovely, are fantastically written.
Yeah,
they feel hard, they feel a lot more harsh, but I do appreciate how much they're kind of. No, we are using the 100%. So if we don't like something, we will give something a low score rather than just giving it 70% that you'll find in the magazines. I quite like their stuff on that. But the writing, I'm not going to read out the whole review of this, but the review is kind of very funny in itself. In how it's written. Yeah, 90% from CU Amiga. The AGA version got 73 in Amiga Power. CD32 version got 70% in Amiga Format. Amiga Power gave the CD32 version 57.
What?
Yeah.
Outrageous.
Yeah. The opposite's got really gorgeous graphics with hundreds of main and incidental animations. Jokes aplenty, you can't get killed. Splendidly used to the CD32 joypad. It's like an eager puppy frisking and gambolling excitedly with a toy in its desire to please. Downers, but one you have to kick and throw into the river because it bites the children.
Oh, wow.
But I think a lot. But what's interesting is that the Amiga Power review of the Amiga Format, a lot of the criticism goes around that apparently the saving system is very difficult to do or use on the CD32, where it goes. So actually, I'll read the first column because I'll be interested to see if you have because you said you got the CD32 version. I'll be interested to see if you had any similar experiences with this. A question, dear readers. What's the point of saving your position in the game? I'm predicting that you'll be saying something like, why, so I can turn it off the game, play something else, and perhaps a week later, load up the original game and carry on from where I left off. You fool. In which case, you'll be crushingly disappointed by Simon the Sorcerer CD32. The save routine all but fills the CD32 story memory, destroying saves from other games. Equally clumsy, if you then play another game and save your position, it will overwrite the Simon save, so you'll either have to play Simon exclusively until you finish it, or resign yourself to restarting when you play again. It's more than annoying, it's downright infuriating. Now, you said you had the CD32 version of that?
Yeah.
Is that...
Well, I mean, so I'll clarify that the version I played 2 weeks ago in preparation for this show was the Steam version. So I played that on my MacBook, so I didn't, obviously no problems with saving. I can't remember having any problems with the CD32 version, but I do very clearly remember on the CD32 system, you could lock a save. You could... there's like a little padlock symbol. You could lock a save to make sure nothing else like deleted it and wrote over it.
Okay.
So I would suggest that whoever that reviewer was, they weren't very familiar with the CD32, and they should have been fired from Amiga Power. Who was it? Let's name names.
Jonathan Nash.
Oh yeah, he was quite good.
But I think. I don't know.
I mean, his criticism there is not really of the game, is it? It's of the console he was using.
I don't think that's fair on the game. I don't think. I mean, I think it seems to be a fair criticism of the actual console in terms of criticism of the console, but I don't think it should affect the actual game itself.
No, definitely.
I mean, then again, there's a whole conversation about modern games about auto saving and whether that's relevant or not. But in terms of saving progress and everything, but yeah, I don't think that's quite right. In terms to like kind of mock the game for something that's beyond the game's control.
Yeah,
So, but yeah, but then again, CU Amiga, CD32 version, 90%.
correct score.
So yeah, so yeah, I think one of the headliners for one of its sections on the CU is the Okie Dokie Lister. Yeah, so and it mentions about Chris Barrie and
Oh, did you notice there is a use of smeg in this game?
no.
Yeah, one of the dwarves in the mine says smegging.
I did not know that.
Yeah, which that's got to be a Red Dwarf reference.
Oh, it's
right?
got to be definitely, yeah. But yeah, Red Dwarf, yeah, and I think Red Dwarf gets mined again by Venturesoft when Robert Llewellyn voices Feeble in the Feeble Files, which is a
Yeah,
game.
I've never played that, but one day I'd like to. I've always been curious.
I've got it. I started playing it and turned it off after about 15
Oh no.
minutes. Yeah, I think I need to, I can't remember why I turned it off, but I got a feeling that if I only lasted 15 minutes playing it, there was a reason. But I can't remember what that reason was. It's been a long time. But it's on my GOG. It's on my kind of GOG games library anyway. So yeah. So I just before days before recording, I asked people online on social media to give us comments on Simon the Sorcerer. Pat9496 on Twitter said that whenever I think about beautiful fantasy forests, I think of Simon the Sorcerer. In fact, let me rephrase that. Every hike through a real life forest has to compete with the forest around the village of Fleur-Deli, which is so yeah. So that's when we're talking about the kind of the kind of lovely, kind of well realised backgrounds. Yeah, so that's had a hint, an impact on Pat. Yeah, and on the We Made This kind of Discord server, we've got Sam Stokes saying that I never played it but I want to, and Lord and Saviour Tony saying that love that game. Can't remember much about it, but I know I loved it. So yeah, so that is Simon the Sorcerer. Yeah, so I think we've reached the end of our conversation, unless there's any kind of lingering things that you wanted to bring up that we've forgotten about.
I mean, yeah, not much more to really say about this game other than I think I'll just end up repeating how much I love it.
Yeah.
To be honest, is it worth briefly? We've mentioned the sequels, and that most of them don't really live up to the original.
Yeah.
I think two was okay from what I remember.
Mm-hmm.
Three I've never played, but from what I gather, it's kind of like an early 3D game, and it got a lot wrong. And then 4 and 5 were made by a completely different team. They were made by a German company, and I have played those. In fact, I reviewed them when they came out, and they were bad. Let me tell you that. Have you played? You've played 2. You said. Have you played any of the other sequels?
No, I've not played 3D. I've not played 3D. I've not played 4 or 5. I've in the lead up to this, I did do look of a let's play of a few of the sequels. I read Simon the Sorcerer through. Not read. I skimmed through Simon the Sorcerer 3D, and I think that's a victim of the early. That early transitional period where they tried to make point and clicks 3D, and it looks like it didn't work properly. 4 and 5, I think 4 looks like it's more pre-rendered 2D. Well, looks like they're kind of pre-rendered 3D characters in a 2D kind of perspective.
Yeah, they were made in the late 2000s.
Yeah.
So you can probably, if you don't know them, you can probably imagine
Yeah.
what they looked like. I think they looked perfectly fine.
Yeah,
to be honest, it was
yeah.
more the kind of the writing quality and the humor just wasn't there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people's criticism online of the character of Simon come from games that aren't the first one.
Yeah.
And I kind of watched a bit of the intro for Simon the Sorcerer 5, and he's a massive, massive dick, mind my language. He's very unlikable in the first few minutes. Yeah, and yeah, which I think goes again. Yeah, I don't think he's supposed to be completely unlikable. I think he's supposed to be more sarcastic rather than being Edward. Yeah, he's like a really lazy kind of talks to
Yeah,
Alex
I think
badly.
given the reliance on like British humour, I think it's if you come from outside of that world, I think it's very very difficult to get the tone of someone like Simon.
Yeah,
Correct?
but he's got an American accent in 4 and 5, which feels
Yeah,
really
that
weird.
ain't right.
Feels really weird. I think it kind of like I think that doesn't kind of work. I think with the tone of things. I think, but yeah, and I think before we kind of close off completely, there is a new Simon the Sorcerer game in production
Yeah,
called Simon Origin.
yeah. It's out in March next year, and it's being marketed as an origin story for Simon the Sorcerer and how he found this, the fantasy world in the first game, which I find very confusing because having played the first game quite a lot, I always felt like this was his first time in the world.
Yeah, I mean, to its credit, he looks 12 in Simon Origins. I would believe that Simon is 12 in this. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I
I don't
mean,
understand how you can make a prequel, but I will definitely be playing it and finding out.
yeah, it's kind of yeah. I find that kind of weird how it can be, how that can happen. I think.
Are you, by the way, are you aware that there are two cancelled Simon the Sorcerer sequels?
No, no,
Oh,
I know there are spin-off games. There's a pinball and a
hmm
puzzle game.
like puzzle
Yeah,
pack.
but it's not
I've never
those.
played either of those. But yeah, there are two cancelled sequels. So the
Ooh, okay.
first one is Simon the Sorcerer 3, not Simon the Sorcerer 3D. So originally, Simon the Sorcerer 3 was designed as another 2D pixel game, fully designed, but they couldn't get any funding from publishers because they kept being told nobody wants 2D games anymore. You have to make a 3D game. So when they made Simon the Sorcerer 3D, they completely redesigned the game, different story, different everything. And I've read interviews with Simon Woodroffe where he said that he's still got all of the designs for this original Simon the Sorcerer 3 and that, he'd love to make it someday. So there's this unmade classic style Simon game that was never finished, which, really captures my imagination. The other one was, I think it was 2014. There was an Irish company called Story Beasts who announced that they acquired the license to make a new game, and they were going to do a Kickstarter to raise funds for it. They showed some concept art. They showed some screenshots. It was 2D, hand drawn. It looked really nice. It was called Simon the Sorcerer Between Worlds. And the idea was Simon would be able to switch between these two different worlds. In one world, he was Simon the Sorcerer. In the other world, he was a new female character. We mentioned earlier that there's not many female characters in this game, not much agency for them. Feels like that cancelled sequel would have gone some way to repairing that. Hopefully, we don't truly know, do we? The really disappointing thing about that sequel is they got Chris Barrie back. And he'd already recorded lines. There's photographs of him in the recording studio for it. So I was really looking forward to that game. And then I don't know what happened. I think they went bust. They never did the Kickstarter and they lost the license. So yeah, a real shame. I think that would have been awesome.
Oh wow! So, yeah, that's sounding like it would be really really good, particularly to try and fix what at this moment in time seems to be a franchise where there's more not so good games than there are
Yeah,
good games.
definitely.
And yeah, to the point where I think there's like the impact of Simon the Sorcerer as a franchise is kind of, I think Simon the Sorcerer's 3D is kind of the big main culprit of that. Kind of affecting that, but I am very intrigued about Simon Origins. I am very very intrigued about that. Also, kind of worried about how it's going to try and fit things in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it exists. I'm glad it's coming out. So I'll give it a fair shake. But it's hard to, with this series, it's hard to get too optimistic because, there's basically out of 5 games, I'd say 1.5 of them is really good.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Oh, what a positive note to end on.
Yes. But this is the really good one. This is really the good one. But and I think with that, Ashley, I think we are at the end of our conversation. So I want to say thank you ever so much for coming on to talk about Simon the Sorcerer. It's been absolutely a lot of fun to kind of revisit Simon and his world and the fantasy world, and just basically just to kind of experience for the first time in ages Chris Barrie for doing the voice of the character. So thank you for that.
Well, yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to come on and chat about one of my favourite games, and it was a good excuse to replay it for the first time in several years. So thank you.
So if people want to find you online, social media, find your blog, where can they find you?
Okay, so I mostly live on Twitter until it all comes crashing down in a few weeks. We'll see where I am after that. No, I think Twitter will still be around for a while. You can follow me on there as Jelly Scare. I don't know why that's my name on there. It just is. I like the name. And I think your listeners will definitely like my blog. I have a blog called Games from the Black Hole. If you search for that online or search for it on Twitter, you will easily find it. I'm going to publish my Simon the Sorcerer blog post tomorrow, so it should be online for anyone to find as soon as they hear this podcast. And I've covered a few other adventure games on there as well. I did something on the ending of Return to Monkey Island. I've covered Universe, which was a sci-fi adventure by Core Design, the people who made Tomb Raider.
Yes.
And I also covered The Stealth Affair, which is a James Bond point-and-click adventure that is a little bit rubbish, but well worth reading about.
Oh, I have to
so yeah, have a look at that.
But yes, Universe, another British kind of one where, but with oddly set in Ashby Dealers, which is
where Rare were based or are based.
Yeah, Universe. Again, I'm not going to spend too long because this isn't a Universe episode. But I remember having that and buying it, and my dad kind of buying it from a car boot sale. And anyone who's had that experience knows exactly what I'm going to say next. There's a part where there's a copy protection part where you have to try and.
Oh no!
Yeah, where you have to try and get a code to go into a car, and I didn't have the manual, but that's a whole other story. So I'm getting PTSD flashbacks of trying to play that on the Amiga. For anyone who wants to follow me or the podcast on the socials, pretty much on Instagram or Twitter, if you search for Ask Us About Loom, you'll find us on there. There's a brief shout out. I also do another podcast called Pick a Disc, which is me talking about people's favourite albums or albums they want to talk about for whatever reason they want to. And also, if you're not listening to this on the Shipwrecks and Comatose feed, I am one of the regular co-hosts of Shipwrecks and Comatose, which is a podcast covering Red Dwarf. You can find us on Red Dwarf Pod on Twitter or on your podcast apps of choice. So if you've enjoyed this conversation, guaranteed you'll probably enjoy listening to Red Dwarf podcast that we do as well. So with that, that's it. This is definitely the end of our conversation, actually. I want to say thank you ever so much again for coming on.
No worries. It's been a pleasure.
Hello everyone, this is Tony Black, co-host and producer of You Have Been Watching, a podcast all about British sitcoms. Myself and co-host Robert Turnbull take you on a range of Britcom subjects and shows in our discussions, including greats such as Fawlty Towers.
Basil, in the same way as David Brent and Alan Partridge and Victor Meldrew. Basil works best when he is actually dealing with arseholes.
Lesser known curios such as 15 Stories High.
There are all these kind of like gag setups being put in place in that episode, and then the sort of the end like minute or so is basically the payoff to all of these gags, and it's very, very sitcom-y.
And even top 10s such as sitcom theme tunes. If we have to put composers of theme tunes in context for British sitcoms, I think Ronnie Hazelhurst, he's possibly the John Williams of...
I was just going to say, he is the John Williams of
I think he is.
British sitcom.
We're available on all podcast platforms and on social media at YHB Watching Pod on Twitter and Facebook. So please subscribe, get in touch, and come and have a laugh with us.